This is the 7th video in a series showing how to set up, configure, test, and debug the MVS toolkit. In this video, we'll cover how debugging the toolkit is a little different from debugging other things, as well as standard D3 and operating system debugging techniques. Something I've learned in my time debugging the toolkit is that debugging the toolkit is slightly different from debugging other things in that there are not that many debugging tools and techniques, but those few techniques will find and fix quite a few problems. This is different from my experience with other products and languages, which seem to have lots of tools and techniques, each of which find and fix fewer problems. As for normal D3 debugging techniques, the best place to start is with list errors and list runtime errors, looking for anything pertaining to the file or subroutine being used by the web service operation or MVSP in general. If you're using connection pooling, you can tandem the MVSP PIB to see if anything funky gets displayed. This will be easier if you have only one or two connection pools defined. If that doesn't help, and you're trying to debug a web service operation that's calling a subroutine, you could try writing a test program that calls the subroutine and look for any weird output or display any return arguments and make sure that you're getting what you expect. Once you find and correct any errors in the subroutine, you'll need to flash compile the subroutine and restart the toolkit server so it picks up the new flash object. For data web service operations, you can use standard AQL techniques against the file. Start by copying the AQL statement out of the toolkit client and pasting it at TCL and watch the output. You can also CT the dict of the file for any ADIs used in the web service operation, or you can do a list item on the file and look for anything unexpected in the data. Here are some of the normal operating system tools used to debug the toolkit. Host name. You can use the host name command to see what the host name of the server is to make sure you're using the correct host name in the toolkit or if you're on the wrong server. etc host file. You can check the host file to see if there is an entry assigning an IPv4 address to the host name you're using. On Linux, the file is hosts in the etc directory. On Windows, the host file is in the Windows System32 drivers etc directory. The reason this is important is that often DNS will resolve a host name to an IPv6 address, which the toolkit cannot use. ipconfig on Windows or ifconfig on Linux. You can use this command to see what the IPv4 address of the server is, and for that matter, whether it has an IPv4 address. Again, the toolkit cannot use IPv6 addresses, so if you can't find an IPv4 address, you'll need help from the network person to find one or set one up. And it should be static if at all possible. Ping. This is used to make sure that you can get to the server on which the toolkit is running by the IP address or the host name. If you ping the host name and get an IPv6 address back, you may need to go to the host file referenced above and add an entry directing the host name to an IPv4 address. Netstat. This is used to see if the toolkit server is listening on either 8181 for requests or on 3410 for configuration. The command on both platforms is netstat -an with a pipe character. Then you use grep on Linux or findstring on Windows, followed by the TCP port to narrow the results. If you don't see a listener, check to see if the server is running using service mv.serve status on Linux, or check the Rocket MV web service in the Windows Service Control Manager. If not running, try starting the service in Windows Services or do a service mvserv start in Linux. Firewall. Check to make sure the firewall is turned off or at least allowing traffic on TCP ports 8181 and 3410 and maybe 9000 while you're at it, although you should have caught 9000 when setting up MVSP. On Linux systems, check the etc selinux config file to make sure that selinux is set to disabled, not permissive or enforcing. If it's not, change it to disabled and reboot Linux. In the next video, we'll talk about running the toolkit server in foreground. If you have any questions about any of the content we've covered so far, please contact Rocket D3 support.